Hello and good evening. Welcome to another webinar panel question and answer discussion hosted by myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Russ Bradford. I'm also a person with Parkinson's, and I'm one half of Parkinson's Concierge, which I co-founded with my partner, Charlotte. Tonight, I'm honored to have some very special guests on our panel this evening. They've kindly given up their time, their personal time, to join us and answer some of the questions that have been coming in since the last webinar we did. The title of tonight's webinar is Life After Lockdown, Part 2, and it's dealing with your mental well-being and employment issues. Many people who've been isolated or furloughed, going back to work could be quite daunting and frightening and raise anxiety amongst a lot of people with Parkinson's. As always, there's a live chat facility on here, so please feel free to ask any further questions as they arise, and we'll endeavour to answer them accordingly. We will keep all questions anonymous, so your name won't be called out. And I must say on this occasion, we've received a phenomenal amount of questions. So if I don't get round to asking yours, again, we'll endeavour to get an answer back from the panelists for you. Behind the scenes, we have some very talented individuals assisting with the tech side of the session, as well as the specialists. So without further ado, please let me introduce tonight's panelists. And in no particular order, we have Victoria Griffith from Parkinsons UK. She's worked as a benefits and employment advisor for Parkinsons UK for 5 years. Her role is to support people with Parkinson's who are going through a tough time or a time of change or difficulty, such as negotiating problems at work or facing dismissal. Victoria also supports Parkinson's local advisors and the Helpline advisors with benefits and employment queries, and she also provides training. Several of her other interests include yoga, meditation, baking, and a lot of reading. Very pleased to welcome you to tonight's session, Victoria.
Thanks, Russ.
Our next one is the very famous Dr. Annette Hand, Nurse and Times Nurse Leader of the Year. She's been put forward to be the nurse to win an award for the Nurse Leader of the Year. Annette joins us for yet another one of our question and answer sessions. Very pleased to that she's given her time to assist with these. She's got over 21 years experience working with Parkinson's, and she's remained passionate about helping people with Parkinson's since she first saw somebody do an apomorphine challenge.
Thanks, Russ.
Next, we are pleased to welcome back Dr. Cliff Chen, a psychologist with first class at the University of Edinburgh, where he's actually won the British Psychological Society Award. He came first in his year. Deep brain stimulation. The list is endless. It goes on and on. So, Dr. Cliff, if you'd like to take yourself off mute, and welcome back to tonight's session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Last but not least is a person who I've had previously dealt with myself, Mary Whelan from Parkinsons UK, a benefits and employment advisor who's been with them for 2 years. She has worked in the advice sector for over 30 years, having started at Citizens Advice in 1989. She has worked in other Citizens Advice bureaus, including Chester, Luton, and Flintshire. She really loves her job at Parkinsons UK, supporting people to maximise their income through benefit checks and challenging DWP decisions, as well as being able to advise on a range of employment issues. The last few months have involved quite on the job, but she does also, when she has a bit of spare time, enjoy hiking, music, and reading. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Russ.
Very pleased to have you on board for tonight's session. So, in no particular order, I'd like to start with a few questions. First of all, just to remind anyone that the helpline at Parkinsons UK is there says, this sounds like it's from a carer. My husband suffers with Parkinson's, and during lockdown, his anxiety has rocketed. He's also concerned about going out after many months of self-isolation. Would some meditation sessions help, do you think?
Yeah, so a little bit about anxiety. In this scenario, anxiety is caused by many things, and it's individual to each person. So I'll be giving a kind of a general, if you like, outline of anxiety. But in this scenario, it sounds like there's a situation that creates a fear. And very often we will cope with that fear by avoiding the situation or the trigger. Now that reduces the fear and makes us feel safe. But in the longer term, that continues the anxiety because we become more fearful of whatever that situation is. We also miss out on opportunities to prove that the feared outcome is less likely than we think or we estimate. There is a fair amount of research suggesting that anxiety and low mood tends to make us overestimate the likelihood of a feared outcome. We also miss out on opportunities to prove that we ourselves can cope with a scenario. And we then miss out also on positive calming activities. So what avoidance tends to do is perpetuate the anxiety and magnify it. So we lose confidence in ourselves over time, and we have fewer and fewer chances for well-being. Now, the treatment, speaking psychologically, of course, there are many reasons. There are medications for it if someone wants to consider that, but it's not my area of expertise. The treatment, of course, meditation would be very helpful for two reasons. For one, it calms the body physiologically. It does that through practice. It must be practiced. But it also helps us uncouple from these worrying trains of thought, which then tends to perpetuate the anxiety if we stay on that train, if you like. I would say to be perhaps most effective, someone who's engaging in meditation for this scenario would probably want to take a stepped approach. So the first one is to start with the meditation and practice lots and start to feel very calm and get good at it. It's a skill, not a pill, as I say before. And once this person is starting to feel the benefit, then they may want to take a graded approach to exposing themselves to going out again. So not to flood himself with the busiest, most stressful environment, but to start small and build up slowly so that one's confidence isn't knocked. Because when we start to go out again, the anxiety is going to spike. If we flood ourselves with the most stressful situation, which is what people do, jump in with both feet, the anxiety spikes, we feel like we can't cope and we run hiding back to our safe place, which then only serves as an example to prove to us that we can't cope. So it actually sets us back. So meditation and gradually exposing ourselves to the anxiety-provoking situation. Over time, we learn to tolerate it and we get better at it. So this can be done without professional help, assuming that the person's motor symptoms aren't too limiting. And there's lots of free meditation videos online. There's lots of apps you can try, like Headspace and Calm, though they may come with a subscription cost. And local mindfulness groups may be online, or they may actually be back in socially distanced groups for all we know. But if more focused professional support is needed, I'd say they can contact their GP, speak to their specialist nurse or their neurologist about a referral onward for psychological support.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic advice, and very well received. And I hope it makes that person feel that the help is out there. You know, all they've got to do is look for the right type of help that they feel they may need. Next question, if I may direct this one to Mary. Can you provide advice on supporting people who are returning to work after shielding, who are or being extremely vulnerable? Anyone who is at high risk of getting a severe illness if they catch coronavirus, i.e. somebody with Parkinson's?
Yes, we can. But to go into more detail, first of all, the advice is to try and work from home if at all possible. If that's not possible in your particular job, the employer is responsible for doing a risk assessment, and they should be thinking about things like allowing you to travel at times of the day which are less busy, making sure you have less contact with the public and keeping 2 meters away. If that's not helpful, you can also, under the Equalities Act 2010, you can ask for reasonable adjustments if you're in the disabled category, which you're likely to be. So there might be other things they can do at work for you to make it safer. So it has to basically be COVID secure before you go back. There's a lot of detail in different industries on the government website for factories, offices, shops. There's quite a lot of detail and the sort of things that an employer should do to make it safer for you. There's also been more money put into access to work. If you've heard of that, that's to help you stay in a job. So they can do things like pay for taxis for you so that you don't have to mix on public transport, maybe provide extra equipment, partitions. So it's on a case-to-case basis. So I'd advise anyone to give us a ring because we might be able to help negotiate with your employer, because if you don't go back to it, they don't have to pay you, but neither can they force you to go back to work. So it is a situation where it might come down to negotiation. Hopefully that helps.
Wow, that's great. And thank you so much for mentioning access to work, because that there is a service that not a lot of people know about, but its intention is to keep people in work and to provide grants or items that allow the person with a disability to be able to stay in their role, as it were. So thanks for bringing that up, Mary. Across to Annette, if I may. Can the stress of the COVID-19 situation make
Sorry, Russ, you've cut out there at the end. Could you repeat that for me?
Sorry, Annette. Can the stress of the COVID-19 situation make Parkinson's symptoms worse?
Okay, thanks, Russ. Certainly over the last few months, we've continued to run a helpline here within the service up in the Northeast and run clinics. And obviously, as Cliff was saying before, there's been an awful lot of anxiety around, not just for people with Parkinson's, but everybody generally has unfortunately suffered with anxiety, I think, due to COVID-19 and the unknown. We do know, Russ, that with obviously trying to cope and manage with anxiety, you need chemicals to do that. And one of those chemicals is dopamine, surprisingly enough. So without that, then it's much more difficult for people with Parkinson's to moderate anxiety and cope and manage with those things and adapt to new ways and patterns. There is anecdotal evidence, we think, that could show us that actually something like this could progress Parkinson's symptoms and worsen symptoms. But I think there's a balance, Russ, about people, being at home, self-isolating, not being as active, not walking as much, particularly as well, not keeping it up with exercise. And we're also seeing a progression in that kind of area too. So whether it's a true progression of the condition itself or because of circumstances people find themselves in, we're not sure yet. So definitely we're saying to people, try and keep as active as you possibly can do, both mentally and physically, exercising at home or in the garden if you've got one, using, Parkinsons UK got some fantastic resources to help with that, looking at things like stress management, as Cliff was saying before, meditation, things that we can do online. But if you're worried about your symptoms at all progressing, please get in touch with the specialist service to have a chat with about how you are, what your symptoms are particularly, and if there's any area in particular you think you are, progressing, because there is potentially that risk with COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Remember, if you are feeling that your symptoms are getting worse, reach out, ask for help. That's what they are there for. If I can go across to you, Victoria, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, which you've done. The question that's come in, I'm 60 years old and I've had PD for the past 6 years. I'm very active and work as a school teacher. I've taught remotely on a virtual platform during the spring, but school will likely restart in-person classes in September. Is it safe for me to return to work, or should I ask? Did you get that question through, Victoria, or?
Hi.
You do seem to be having...
It did freeze a little bit, Russ. So I heard you say, is it safe for me to return to work? So if you could maybe pick up the question after that.
Is it safe for me to return to work, or should I ask to teach remotely?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. We have had a lot of calls to the helpline from people working in schools because it's been a difficult situation. And obviously the schools in Scotland have already gone back, and we're looking at the other schools in different areas. And things are changing quite quickly depending on whether it's a primary school or a secondary school, because we've just heard now that some secondary school teachers and students are going to be encouraged to wear face masks, whereas before the governments were saying that that wasn't necessary. So I think it is a difficult situation in schools. As Mary said earlier, if there's a possibility of working from home, then it's definitely worth investigating that with your employer, because the advice is still that for vulnerable people, so people with Parkinson's are classed as being in a vulnerable group, and because of coronavirus, then those people, if possible, should work from home. So this teacher could potentially continue to work remotely. Having said that, I know a lot of teachers that have called us and teaching assistants have said they really want to get back to work and work with the children in the classroom. And the school should have done a risk assessment, as Mary mentioned earlier. So each school should have their own risk assessment, and you can ask your employer for a copy of that so you can see what measures are in place. And some schools have actually made a video that's on their website for students and staff, so that you can see how they've laid out the school, and perhaps they've got a one-way system so people are walking around without, coming into collision with each other in the corridors. They may have staggered the opening and closing times so that only certain classes are leaving at a particular time and coming in at a particular time. And that's how they're trying to make the social distancing work in the school. So I think that the government is saying that schools are safe to go back into, but as Mary said in answer to the earlier question, as somebody with Parkinson's, you have additional rights at work under the Equality Act, or in Northern Ireland, the Disability Discrimination Act. And what that means is you can ask for additional help with reasonable adjustments. So if you are back in the classroom and you think there's a particular thing that's disadvantaging you and you feel worried about it, you could say to your employer, well, the other teachers, for example, might be doing it this way, but I'd like you to make an adjustment for me to do it a different way. And they should do that for you under the Equality Act. So it's $1 million question, really. Should I go back to work, and is it safe to go back to work? But I think that for most people, talking to their employer and looking at the risk assessment is the best first step to help make that decision. Is that helpful, Russ, do you think?
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's quite comprehensive. It also points out the issues that a lot of people are facing in the current climate. I know we talked about schools, which, you know, are run as a public, run by, I should say, where things may be a bit more challenging. Could be like for an employer who's got so many staff, and some, you know, he's having to pay to make the adjustments for the staff, and the person with Parkinson's steps forward and says, but I need extra, I need this, I need that. It could be construed that it's a cost burden, and I certainly hope that nobody goes through that. But remember, if you are concerned about that, please phone the Parkinsons UK helpline.
Yes, definitely, because
And
there
the
might
team
be
at
small.
Parkinsons UK.
Sorry, I was going to say there might be small adjustments that can be made. So, for example, you might want to work separately in an office rather than being in an office with a number of different people, and that could be possible. Or it might be coming in at a different time so that you're not having to travel on public transport. So there might be quite small adjustments that can be made. But if there is going to be a cost, that's when the Access to Work scheme might be able to help employers with that extra cost. And that's where Access to Work is a really good place to go. But if there are any concerns about talking to your employer and the employer is not being supportive, then definitely we can help on our helpline, and also ACAS, who run an employment advice helpline, can give people advice.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Before I go on to the next question, I would just like to make a point to anyone watching, and bear in mind, at this difficult time for us all, it is important to remember that charities up and down the country are struggling to continue to offer the levels of support and assistance we have been accustomed to. For example, the telephone support lines, etc., they are difficult to maintain with reduced funds, along with the increased reliance upon them to assist with all our anxiety and worries during this, what we can only describe as unprecedented situation. The number of cancelled fundraising events, outdoor activities, local group meetings, at this time of year, they should be in full swing. But with them having to be cancelled for social distancing reasons or lockdown, this alone has had a phenomenal impact on funding and sponsorship. If you're able to, please donate to the charity. The button will be on your screen, or the links on your screen. And please get your friends and colleagues to do the same. Remember, Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological condition in the world. So you will be helping to spread the word and educating people about this terrible disease. Right, Dr. Cliff, if I can come back to you, please. And I have Parkinson's. I've been feeling depressed and alone. And also I have been feeling isolated. Now that lockdown is easing, I thought I would be okay, but I'm not sure I want to go out as I've lost my confidence.
Yes. So I could sense that myself and Annette are going to be doing sort of a relay. So as she mentioned, there are chemicals associated with Parkinson's. So I will let her address that side of things. But essentially, one may, start off feeling depressed as a result of the condition, and then they may have a reactive or a psychological component to it, which is coming to terms with the condition. So what I'm not clear on from the question is whether or not this person is feeling depressed and alone anyway, or feeling depressed and alone as a result of the lockdown. Assuming it's the lockdown, then it's worth reiterating the advice I mentioned to the other question, which is it tends to shut us away from opportunities for well-being, and that's enforced. We had to stay in, so we didn't have those opportunities, and we can become avoidant of it afterwards because it can become challenging to do that. It can be anxiety provoking. Another thing that can happen in Parkinson's is someone develops apathy, which is an inability to initiate or get involved in things, and it isn't necessarily quite the same as depression. But the main thing then is to recognize that what we're doing is shutting ourselves away from positive experiences, and therefore perpetuating the low mood and perpetuating the avoidance. So a graded approach to going back out again is going to be important, particularly if one is feeling lacking in confidence or not able to take that first step because they're picturing, well, this is what I used to do. Well, let's not start there. Let's start with step 1 and build back up to step 10, which is where you were before lockdown. So that graded approach is important. Start small and build up. They may also wish to think about something in CBT terms we call behavioral activation, which just means doing things. So they may want to start scheduling in activities that might just be at home, and building those up as well. Now, I often use an acronym to help describe this to the people I work with, and it's PAMS, P-A-M-S. And I say PAMS is your friend. So PAMS stands for pleasure, achievement, mastery, and social contact. And what that means, if I were to use an example, is each activity has the potential to bring pleasure to us. So pleasure is just an activity that's enjoyable for no reason other than for its own sake, like listening to music or eating a meal. Achievement is getting something ticked off the list. It's not necessarily pleasurable, like, mowing the grass may not be pleasurable to some people, but the sense of achievement afterwards is what's good about it. Mastery is developing ourselves in some way, small way, and social contact is self-evident. Now, when planning our activities, if we have components of PAMS, pleasure, achievement, mastery, or social contact, even all 4 in one activity, all the better. That will tend to lift our mood because these are the key things that people need anyway. Now, again, this is something you can start doing yourself, but if you need help, obviously speak to your GP, your nurse, or your neurologist if you want a referral on for psychological support.
Thank you so much. Annette, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose I do, Russ. Just that this is something that comes up all the time at the minute, and I think it's kind of reassuring people that they understand that there are, changes that are happening within Parkinson's, within the brain, within chemical pathways that make people with Parkinson's much more susceptible to these feelings. That they are certainly not alone, but there are definitely strategies, as Cliff has mentioned there and talked about, that can be really helpful. So it's really trying to engage with those strategies. It's not necessarily about having to take more medication or more pills or changing your Parkinson's drugs. But there are things that can help to, master those skills, as Cliff has said, that they're not things that you can just, do straight away. They take practice and time and effort. But for me, it's really important to understand what's going on within the brain, within Parkinson's, and you're greater risk for these things. So don't feel alone with it. But there are definitely things that can help improve how you're feeling.
Thank you for that extra bit there. Mary, if I may come to you with the next question. The question that's come in is asking what measures is an employer in their workplace?
Sorry, I lost you then.
Sorry, we do seem to be having some technical difficulties with this. Ask you that again, Mary. What what measures is an employer legally obliged to put in place before a person with Parkinson's returns to work?
Well, with regard to COVID-19, they would have to make sure it was COVID secure and do a whole risk assessment. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of guidance to each industry, factories, offices, shops, as to all the things they need to put into place to do with COVID, making sure that the person wouldn't be at risk. And that would, traveling to work as well would come into it, to make sure that they can travel at less busy times. They'd have to go through the whole risk assessment, and if someone wasn't happy with it, they could refer to health and safety to get them involved.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that. I know quite often some of the questions come in are quite personalized, and although the response or the answer could cover a multitude of other questions, we've got to try and keep them specific. Now that one there sounded very individual, so that particular person didn't state what job they've got.
No, we want further information. Yeah,
exactly. And based on that answer, please don't forget that the helpline is there to take your questions, your concerns, and try and work with you on a more individual basis to give you a more tailored package, rather than like a one size fits all. They're there to listen to you and to work through a strategy that is more relevant for you. So please, there's no shame, absolutely no shame in reaching out and asking for help on the helpline. So if I may go to Victoria. And her employer has set her a deadline. What can I do?
Sorry, Russ, it's very frustrating for you, but every time you ask a question, you freeze. So I didn't hear that question. Can you repeat it for me?
Yeah, no problem. I'd just like to say, it does appear that we're having some difficulties tonight with the broadband. So I do apologise for that. The question to you, Victoria, was that my mother has Parkinson's and is increasingly anxious because she feels she's not able to go back to work, but her employer has set a deadline. What can she do?
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. So that's a very difficult situation, because the government is relying on employers to be sensitive and thoughtful with people, but that's not a legal thing. The government is asking employers to think about people, and some employers are really good at that, and other employers can be a bit more difficult and perhaps not dealing with people in such a good way. And it sounds like this question is coming from that angle, that the employer has said, well, you've got to come back to work by this set deadline. It may be that the person who asked that question, her mother has Parkinson's, and it sounds as if she could be on the government furlough scheme. And the employer is saying the furlough scheme is coming to an end at this point, and you've got to come back by this deadline. We don't know from that question, but it's possible. So the furlough scheme is continuing until the end of October. So if the person is on the furlough scheme and the employer is saying that you need to come back before that time, it might be worth talking to the employer about whether they can extend that furlough scheme for longer for that person. And there's also something now in the furlough scheme called flexible furlough, which means that you could come back part-time. You wouldn't necessarily, if you're a full-time worker, have to come back full-time. So if there are parts of the job that could be done, perhaps working from home or a bit more manageably, then that person could ask about flexible furlough. But if the person isn't on the furlough scheme and they haven't been getting furlough payments and they have just been off, I don't know, perhaps getting sick pay or something like that, and now they're being asked to come back to work, then I think the most important thing is to try and have a discussion with the employer about what's been put in place to make the workplace safe. As we've heard with other questions, not doing something for a long time does make you feel much more anxious about doing it. And sometimes just being able to go in and look at the workplace and have an informal visit without the pressure of actually being at work, perhaps wearing a face mask and just having a tour around when it's shut at the end of the day or it's a quiet time, can help to reassure people about what's been put in place to make that workplace secure. So I would suggest talking to the employer and saying, if the deadline is coming up, could I perhaps come for a short visit and have a look at what's been put in place and how I'm going to do my job when I come back after lockdown, and how that's going to feel. And it might be that that will be reassuring. But if the person goes to look at the workplace or isn't able to do that and still feels very uncomfortable about going back to work, then I think it's important to get some advice about their situation. Because if they say they really don't feel they can go back to work, then they need to seek some specialist advice to see what their rights and options are. So, for example, that could be from an employment advisor like myself or like Mary through the Parkinsons UK Helpline, or it could be through a union representative if somebody's a member of a union. And a lot of people can contact their union and the union will be able to support them. Or it could be through the ACAS helpline, which I mentioned before, which is a specialist employment helpline there for employees to support them. There are quite a lot of different options, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think that if people are really, really concerned that they can't return to work and they're not able to talk to their employer and get a satisfactory response, then it's important to get some specialist help and advice about what those options are, because there's a financial implication.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine. I work at Parkinsons UK as well, and I think Russ, you're live again. We're having such palavers with the Zoom this evening. Russ, do you want to carry on, or shall I ask the next question and see if it comes back to life?
Are you getting me through okay, or are we?
It just all froze there again.
Cut? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go for it. If it freezes again, I'll pretend to be you. I won't be as good.
Yeah. Victoria, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Question, and I'll try and get back in.
Do you know what, Russ? That didn't come through. I'm really sorry. I'll give it a go, keep the flow going, and hopefully it will come back to life again in a minute. So, Victoria, Russ was about to ask you another question. You're really getting put on the spot here. And this question has come through on the chat this evening. And just wondering, if somebody's needing help writing a CV, can Parkinsons UK give support with that?
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us, probably a lot of people are thinking about writing a CV or updating a CV. Particularly, we've had a lot of inquiries from people recently who are being made redundant or are worried or threatened with redundancy. So it is that time of dusting out and looking at the CV. Unfortunately, we don't offer that as a service. But at Parkinsons UK, we're a very small team of benefits and employment advisors. So we're focusing really on supporting people with their rights and options with employment, rather than how to present themselves to a new employer. But we could maybe look at some links for the person who's asked that question to see if there are any other places they could go for help. There certainly is a national careers service which is available for adults, and they might be able to help with writing a CV. In the old days, job centres might have been able to provide that support, but a lot of job centres are still closed at the moment. So I think starting with the National Careers Service would be a good place to look on their website and see if they can help.
I think that's great advice, Victoria. And for the person that asked the question, thank you so much for asking it. So my job at the charity is a director of all our support services. I think I'll take that as an action to look about how we can make sure we've got guidance and add it into the work that we do. Because I think those questions are going to come, Mary and Victoria, aren't they, for people? So yeah. Russ, you're moving about on the screen. Should I pass back to you?
I hope that you can still hear me.
Can.
Are
Go,
you able
go,
to hear
quick.
me, Catherine?
Yep.
Right. This is a question for Dr. Annette. My husband is prone to urinary tract infections, which has often led to hospital visits in the past. I really want to avoid the A&E in the hospital right now because of the COVID situation. Is there anything I can do?
Hi, yes, there's lots you can actually do for this. We do know that people with Parkinson's can have problems with bladder and with urgency and frequency, and sometimes also infections like you're describing. And there's some basic advice that we provide for lots of people, really, and that's around the fluids. So it's really important you're drinking plenty of fluids, and the recommendation is at least 6 to 8 glasses of clear fluids, potentially water or juice per day. You want to avoid things like tea and coffee because they act as a diuretic and make people want to pee more. So you want to make sure that you're drinking enough fluids to keep you going. And that also helps with constipation, because if you're constipated, that can also impact then on the bladder and make people want to go to the toilet more, which is obviously, going to cause more problems. It's about regular exercising again. So that's been really difficult during the last few months. But again, exercise actually makes a big difference on the bladder. So it's important that you regularly exercise. And even things like, the clothing and underwear, keeping it cotton rather than kind of like a man-made fabric, and avoiding things like nylon can help to dry those areas. Weight is an issue too. So if people are overweight, that can have an impact on their bladder. But I would say if he's prone to regular urinary tract infections, to be seen by a specialist team in service, because it may well be that, being referred through to a contingency team, having a look at how much he's passing urine, having a look if he's voiding properly, having a look at some proper advice, doing some proper diary work in terms of the amount of fluids he's taking and amount of fluids he's passing, along with, diaries looking at both bowel and bladder could be helpful in the long run. Some people, unfortunately, are prone to urinary tract infections and might need a low-grade antibiotic as well. But again, that would need to be properly assessed and looked at, along with thinking about medications that you might be taking, because some of those can actually irritate the bladder and make people want to wee more and pass more. So there are a heap of things that you can do, yourself. That's basic advice. Parkinsons UK have a really lovely booklet on looking after your bowels and bladder. That's got it all detailed in there. But if it's something you're concerned about and he's regularly having, then I would suggest going back to the GP or going to see your specialist team of service. And certainly somebody like myself as a specialist nurse, I could refer you through to a continent advisor to have a look at bowels and bladder in particular, looking at that bladder, making sure that everything's working as it should do. And if not, providing proper advice, support and training in that area.
Thank you very much for your answer there, Dr. Annette. Mary, if I may come to you next.
Yeah.
The question that's come in is, I have been questioning more why I have been selected for redundancy after COVID. The person has Parkinson's and they know another person has kept their job in a similar role who doesn't have or doesn't appear to have anything wrong with them. So I think what they're basically saying is that they've been, sidestepped to keep the person who's healthy in their position. Is that something that could be addressed in this question?
Yes, it can. Unfortunately, we're hearing this quite a lot lately in this scenario. But what would have to be checked is the selection procedure that the employer has followed, because there's a whole process employers have to follow, which depending on the size of the employer is depending on which process they follow, but they all have to use a fair selection criteria. So that, and they have to consult with the employee. So they should be given details about how they were selected, and then they might be able to challenge that it's not based on objective criteria. They also have to consider them for another role if there's one available. So they have to consult, use a fair selection procedure, and consider them for another role. And this all has to be open and transparent. So they should be able to go to the consultation, have it all explained to them. And then if they're not happy with it, if they don't think it's objective, they can challenge it. Because it may well be that it's a case of discrimination. And again, in this case, they're protected under the Equalities Act 2010. So they might have a case for discrimination. It's very difficult because they're going to have to decide if they think they've got a case, whether they want to spend their time fighting it, going to an employment tribunal, which can take over their life, or give it up as a bad job. But if it's caught early on, it may be something that it could reach, they could contact ACAS, who will try and reach a settlement before it gets to a tribunal. In each case, they will try and do that, so it doesn't have to go to a tribunal.
It's such a shame, such a
Yes,
shame.
it is.
Like you say, we're hearing this more and more.
Very difficult.
Dr. Cliff, if I can come to you next, but before I do that, I'd just like to remind the viewers that it's a difficult time for us all. It's important to remember that charities up and down the length of the country are struggling to continue to offer the levels of support, help and assistance that we, people with Parkinson's, have all been accustomed to. Just for example, the telephone support lines, they are difficult to maintain with reduced funds, along with an increased reliance upon them to assist with us all, our anxiety, our worries during these unprecedented times. I mean, we're in, what are we in, August, September, August, you know, this should be the prime time for outdoor activities, fundraising, cycling events, zip wires, jumping out of airplanes, doing tandem parachutes, all in an effort to make to raise much needed funds for charities. So, you know, the number of these events that are being cancelled, it's all having a phenomenal impact on the funding and sponsorship, especially to Parkinsons UK. I therefore kindly ask you to remember that Parkinsons UK seriously need your help. If you are able, please donate to the charity. There should be a button or a link on the screen, and get your friends and colleagues to please do the same. Remember that Parkinson's is the fastest growing neurological condition in the world. Not only will you be helping out this charity, you'll also be helping to spread the word and educating people about this terrible condition. So, Dr. Cliff, over to you, sir. The question that's come in, I have never gambled before, but during COVID-19 and the lockdown, I've suddenly started playing bingo online. Now I've become obsessed with getting 5 games in every day. I have now got an appointment with my neurologist, but however, I wanted to share my story with others. Is it the medication, or could it just be with me?
This is an excellent question, and I'm going to attempt to answer it, and then perhaps tag Annette in after I've finished, so she can correct any mistakes I've made. But I do work with people who would be considered to have impulse control problems or impulse control disorders, which is what this sounds like. So sometimes the Parkinson's medication, especially dopamine agonists like pramipexole, can cause people to become obsessed about reward-based activities. So gambling, shopping, sex is one of them, and eating, and so on. So any activity that offers some emotional reward, so in this case, perhaps the thrill of gambling and possibly winning money, can become addictive under these circumstances. Now, you may or may not have gambled in the past, though in my experience in supporting people with impulse control disorders, there often is a history of that somewhere, even if it wasn't out of control. Or if you have, or rather, you should definitely speak to your neurologist or your Parkinson's nurse, speak to your family about it as well, because people can lose large sums of money, and it can have quite significant and devastating financial and psychological effects on the family and the person. If it's the medication, usually it stops or reduces when you lower the dose. But again, Annette will speak to that, I'm sure. In my experience, occasionally it does come back, actually. And less often it does occur with other medications, I think, like your dopamine replacement medication. So sometimes when I'm working with someone, lowering the dose isn't so clear an option because it may affect their motor control. So again, I speak as a psychologist who works with this. And so when I'm working with it, I'm often having to work with the MDT, speak to people like Annette and the neurologist about what I want to suggest. But that said, all of that biological stuff said about the medication, in my experience, situational and psychological factors do also play their part. During lockdown, we may have had less opportunity for stimulation. Maybe we're bored or we're fed up. So we may fall prey to less than helpful ways of achieving that stimulation, like gambling. So in terms of, I kind of touched on the medication because the person brought it up, and it's very relevant. But in terms of the psychological approach to treating it, that I would take, obviously assuming that people like Annette and neurologists are also tackling the medication side, is first and foremost admitting there is a problem. Too often people come to me and it's months down the line, they've been keeping it secret and they have racked up tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, and it's a terrible situation. So admitting there's a problem is the first step. Getting family support to stop, to protect finances is important. And then identifying, I would work with someone to identify their triggers. So is it boredom? Is it anxiety? Is it feeling lonely? Is it arguments with a partner that send us into this place to fixate or obsess on gambling or the game or whatever it might be? If we address those triggers in a more helpful way, we introduce, say, a different activity, something that's a bit more helpful as a way of managing those triggers, those psychological triggers, that is, if they're relevant. Then we have a chance of bringing us back online into a more helpful and adaptive way of functioning. And of course, I need to say this should always be done in conjunction with, when I say psychologically, with your neurologist and your Parkinson's nurse.
Thank you so much. Very good advice, and thank you for mentioning the fact that the other members of the family should be brought in to try and, identify that that person is going through changes. And not only by doing so will you be helping that person, you'll actually be learning a little bit about the condition itself, which is, priceless, because this condition sneaks up on people, young or old. It's not the atypical retirement age person that is likely to get Parkinson's nowadays. And Victoria and Mary have both told me that their role is dealing more with younger onset people, who it may affect a little bit harder, because the younger age do have, or are more quite likely to have, mortgages, young family. They're in the middle of their careers, so the actual effect on their mindset could be amplified by that fact. So thank you very much for your answer. Dr. Annette, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I will do, Russ. Unfortunately, we see impulse control disorder really quite regularly. Stats suggest that up to 20% of people will have this condition, but I think it's probably higher than that when we look at the people that we see and I look after. We have to remember that this can happen at any stage. So impulse control disorder, people think it's just related to medication, and yes, it is around the medication, but it can happen with any of the Parkinson's drugs at all. So it's not just the agonists, but I've seen it across every single class of drug that we use. And it doesn't have to happen just when you change medications or alter dosages. I've seen it happen, incidentally happen 2 years after we've changed a dose of medication. It doesn't have to just be at that time of changing a dose or increasing a dose or adding a new medication. It can happen years afterwards. As Cliff said, it can build up very gradually. So just starting off very small things happen, but then kind of getting out of control. So we always try to make sure that we involved, as Cliff has said, the families, partners, partners and husbands and wives in conversations to warn people about this behaviour, and even ask about it at each kind of a follow-up appointment that can happen, because we do know the devastating effects it can have. So certainly, as Cliff said, there are things that we can do to support that individual or support impulse control disorders, but we have to do that in combination. Yes, we can think about reducing medications and we can think about, cutting down dosages. But again, that's balancing out between the impact that might have then on your Parkinson's and your Parkinson's control. So again, it's often a balancing out and support. But I think Cliff got it really well, but it is very much a common thing that we see all the time. So please talk to your specialist about it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And just to remind you, we did start a little bit late tonight. Tonight's session has been called Life After Lockdown Part 2, where we've been dealing with anxiety, etc., and the phenomenal change in the workplace environment, going back to work. And what we say is, if you've got any concerns whatsoever, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Parkinsons UK's helpline, who can deal with any concerns that you have on a more one-to-one basis. Okay, because everyone's condition is slightly different. And just like Parkinson's itself, it affects people in different ways. So, going out into the big wide world after we've all been told to isolate and lock down for a little while, we've missed out on the spring. We're at the back end of the summer now. The world truly is a different place. But with the right mindset and everything, we certainly hope that things will get back to a better norm fairly soon.
Ross, Catherine, could I just add in a little bit about the last question about the gambling, if that'd be all right?
Absolutely.
Just to say, if you have been gambling more and you happen to have got into debt because of it, it's something else. Don't brush it away under the carpet. Please do seek advice to support that sort of financial management. Again, we're absolutely here to help. Call our helpline. We've worked with clients where we've been able to come to arrangements with creditors and support people to manage those issues through fairly sympathetically. And we've given clients, people living with Parkinson's, backup advice and guidance that they can use to talk to a credit card company, whoever it might be, so that the credit card company has a better understanding of Parkinson's too. So please don't be embarrassed. Just give us a shout. We're absolutely here to help, and you wouldn't be the first. You really wouldn't.
Thank you for that, Catherine. It's very important to remember that the help is there. Don't feel ashamed to ask for help if you need it, or if you've got any concerns about a relative or a friend or a family member who you feel could benefit from that advice. So thank you very much to my panelists tonight. We've had Dr. Cliff Chen, who holds a doctorate in clinical psychology. Thank you so much for your time tonight on the panel. Dr. Annette Hand, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thanks, Russ, always.
Mary Whelan and Victoria Griffith.
Thank you.
From Parkinsons UK, Benefits and Employment Advisors. They've been wonderful tonight, and working alongside us, again, Catherine Crawford, from Parkinsons UK. Thank you so much for your help and for stepping in when my screen froze.
No, that's all right. Well, we need to practice that tag team for another time, Russ. Yeah, pleasure.
Absolutely. So to my panelists, thank you so much for all that you've done tonight and all that you've given, and long may you continue to help support people with Parkinson's. It's very much appreciated, I can tell you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Russ.
Thank you so much.